If there is neither Hellenic nor Judea, should the Church struggle for its ethnic purity? How important is canonization? Does the Patriarch of 4 million believers have the right to tell a Patriarch of 20 million believers what he should do? Can a church, which split from a filial church in the early stages of its development, be called a mother church? This and another disputable issues in the history of Orthodoxy in Ukraine will be considered in a cycle of programs: Ukrainian and Russian Orthodox churches, a story of brotherly love, betrayal, and a fight for people's souls. Everything is within the framework of the project Pro et Contra. Ukrainian territories were not the first to adopt Christianity. The teachings of Christ became a state religion in Armenia and Georgia in the early 4th century. In Bulgaria, episcopal cathedrals were established as early as in the 1st century. According to a legend, all Christian churches were established by St. Andrew, the first named. The same church legends can be found in Russian chronicles. It is considered that the history of Ukrainian Christianity dates back to the 1st century from the visit of St. Andrew the First Named. The early stages of Christianization are described in literature. In truth, Christianity was established as a state religion in the 10th century. The Ukrainian nation per se also began to form starting from the 10th century, so the adoption of Christianity was an important stage in establishing Ukrainian statehood.
Тобто, прийняття християнства це було якісним стрибком у розвитком нашої державності.
However, conventional historians, as well as historians of the Church, cast doubt on the visit of St. Andrew the First Named to Ukrainian lands. It is a surprising fact that initially Apostle Andrew planned to visit Rome, but decided to sail up the Dnieper River through Varangian lands and traveled by sea around Europe, taking into consideration the option of Greeks and Romans that these lands were wild and Varangian. Such a decision of Apostle Andrew seems quite strange. Besides that, there are no historic references to the visit of the Apostle Andrew to Ukrainian lands in chronicles, including the Laurentian Chronicle. The legend about the Apostles' trip was mentioned in later sources. Be that as it may, this journey is not mentioned in the legend about Boris and Gleb, though it is known for the certain that the Apostle St. Andrew visited small and Tsarist Scythia.
В період з 65-го року після Різдва Христового
Starting from 65 AD, from the times of St. Andrew the First Named, communities of Christians and pagans coexisted on the territory of modern-day Ukraine. Executions described in chronicles were hardly on the same massive scale as in the Roman Empire.
Літописи навряд чи вони були масовими, як в часи Римської імперії.
The chronicles say that allegedly before the baptism of Rus, people who inhabited those lands were so wild that priests burned them to ancient gods. So speaking of religious tolerance was out of the question. But historians of the 20th century deny it. At least 100 years before the official baptism of Kievan Rus, the massive Christian community had already existed on these territories and even built its own temples. Although Christian believers were predominantly merchants, rich people of Greek and Varangian origin, or they were part of the common people that were independent from princes.
Храми до Володимира на Русі існували. Яскравим підтвердженням.
Temples existed in Kiev and Rus even before the reign of Prince Volodymyr the Great. A memorial plaque near the Ilinska church is evidence of that. It is famous because in 907 the Rusici ratified an agreement with the Greeks in this temple, which was made of wood at that time. How Volodymyr the Great could be the founder of the first Christian temple if temples had already existed at that time? Clearly, the reference is to a stone temple built by Volodymyr the Great.
Що все-таки мова йде про кам'яний храм, збудований Володимиром.
A few years earlier, Volodymyr the Great built a pagan pantheon of gods near his palace. He thought that every tribe or union had a supreme god. If he gathered them and brought them into one line, close to the princely throne, the tribes would also unite under the reign of the Prince of Kievan Rus. But Volodymyr the Great failed to do that. So Volodymyr decided to wager on an existence of a single god. As he needed a monotheistic religion, he chose Christianity, but he faced two problems. One was how to convince people to abandon their old faith. Fortunately, he found a way to do just that.
В більшості країн Європи поряд із репресивними якихось заходами християнство, воно все ж таки
Just as in many European countries, Christianity, together with other repressive methods, prevailed as it coincided with local faiths and cults. In other words, it incorporated the elements of pagan faiths and adapted them. As I understand, Perun became Elijah the prophet who performed the appropriate functions. More precisely, he was believed to have created thunder and lightning.
Перун громовежі став Ілею пророком, який відповідні теж має функції пов'язані з громом і блискавкою.
The second problem was more of a priority. Volodymyr the Great had to adopt Christianity himself and baptize people of the highest ranks. There are many myths on this topic. There is almost an official version that Volodymyr the Great was baptized in Korsun, the present-day Crimean Chersonesus, after a triumphal military campaign against Byzantium. He expected to marry a relative of the Byzantine emperor. But there is another version about the place of baptism of the Kievan prince.
Володимир охрестився у тогочасному літописному Василеві, який він заснував неподалік Києва.
Volodymyr the Great was baptized in the town of Vasiliev. As it was written in a chronicle, he founded his own town on the outskirts of Kiev. The prince named his town in honor of his baptism there. It is difficult to say whether he was baptized in 986 or 987 or 988. Yakov Mnik, a monk of Kiev Patriarch monastery, is convinced that Volodymyr the Great was baptized in 987.
Те, що Володимир охрестився в 987 році.
In the opinion of Yakov Mnik, Volodymyr the Great was forced to do that secretly. Otherwise, had the prince and his attendants openly declared their baptism, it would have incited an uprising against the authorities or a rebellion of the Magi, and an internal civil war would enhance his position in relations with Byzantium. Noteworthy is that the grandmother of Volodymyr the Great Princess Olha, planned to conclude an alliance with Byzantium, but she was refused by the emperor twice in Constantinople. Historians believe that the emperor refused to conclude an alliance with Kievan Rus as Prince Sviatoslav, a blatant adherent of old pagan traditions and an opponent of baptism and Christianity, had to inherit the Kiev throne after Princess Olha.
Україна 4 рази спробувала приймати християнство до офіційного прийняття у 988.
Ukraine tried to adopt Christianity 4 times.
Про княгиню Ольгу, яка була християнка.
This is about Princess Olha, the grandmother of Prince Volodymyr. Of course, her son Sviatoslav, father of Volodymyr the Great, did not want to adopt Christianity because it hindered him. We also know that Kievan princes attempted to adopt Christianity as early as in the 9th century, in the times of Saints Cyril and Methodius. After all, Kievan Rus was an extremely powerful state that competed even with Byzantium on religious issues. Kievan Rus also competed with other countries in the church structure. 1 year after the official baptism of Rus, Volodymyr the Great started building a cathedral church in Kiev. This meant that a priest who couldn't be under a bishop had to serve in the church. In this case, we're talking about the first metropolitan of Rus, Mikhail, sent from Constantinople. The factual presence of a hierarch of such a high rank is a confirmation that a few Christian communities already existed at that time in Kievan Rus. It is a well-proven historic fact that 4 Christian unions, the Kiev Metropole and the Volyn, Chernihiv and Pereyaslav episcopates, had already existed for a decade before the year 1000.
Були і греки, і вони дуже ревниво відносились
There were Greeks. They were extremely jealous of Slavs because they believed as follows: they are Greeks and only they are true Christians. Then there were barbarians. That was their attitude towards Slavs in the Balkans. I visited Bulgaria several times and I heard how the Greeks spoke about Bulgarians with indignation. They call Bulgarians Slavs or migrants from Volga, Bulgaria, and they cannot be Christians. But later, metropolitans and Slavic bishops excelled the Greeks in implementing the moral principles of Christianity.
Моральних засад християнства за тих самих греків.
Written sources preserved to this day testify that our ancestors from Kievan Rus were not only more religious than Greeks, but they were also more educated. This fact is mentioned in a word on law and grace by first Russian metropolitan Ilarion. The adoption of Christianity and baptism of prince attendants in Pachina did not incite mass opposition in society of that time, but the same cannot be said about the people who lived on present-day Russian territories.
Було повстання в Новгороді, де насправді довелося військовою
An uprising flared up in Novgorod because Christianity was planned there by military force. There were local conflicts in distant settlements, but we do not possess sufficient information about them. Christianity was finally introduced in the northeastern part of the Russian Federation only in the 12th century.
На території сучасної Російської Федерації, звичайно, там християнство остаточно утвердилось не раніше 12 століття.
Prominent representatives of power of northern lands were Yuri Dolgoruki and his son Andrei Bogolubsky. The latter is remembered as the person who burned and plundered Kiev in 1169. And Yuri Dolgoruki was nicknamed Dolgoruki or Long-Armed for his avaricious trespass of a princely throne. He was poisoned by Kievans for that. First of all, the personality of Prince Yuri is interesting for us because he succeeded to evict one of the two Russian metropolitans out of their post during his 2-year reign. His name was Klim Stalatic. He was appointed by the head of the church that was true to the people for his dedication and ascription to moral principles.
Християнство прийшло на Суздальське князівство ще до утворення, до організації Москви, до утворення.
Christianity was adopted in the Suzdal Principality long before Moscow was established. Christianity had its roots in Kiev and only Kiev. It did not come from Byzantium, as Byzantium had a great influence on these northern and eastern European lands only through Kiev.
Тому, звідки могло? Через що? Через Хазарію? Через татаро-монгольську іго? Через Золоту Орду?
How else could it have such influence on them? Through Khazaria or the Golden Horde. But these facts are not mentioned in any written sources. We can only fantasize and write novels on this, but all facts testify that Christian colonization of northern Russian lands began in Kiev. By the way, the Novgorod Episcopal Cathedral gained its autonomy from Kiev exactly for selling the interest of its metropole. Then Yuri Dolgoruki expelled Russian Metropolitan Klim Stalatic, who was not a protege of Byzantium, from his post. Constantinopolitan Patriarch himself thanked the prince for such work and granted autonomy to Novgorod Bishop Nifton for his obedience. In his turn, the Novgorod hierarch dissociated himself from the Kiev Patriarchate and avowed himself as servant of Byzantium. So this makes it quite clear why Kiev princes and church hierarchs were left with no choice but to search for an alternative to Constantinople as their ecclesiastical hub.
Тісні взаємини, власне, Києво-Руської.
The tightly knit mutual relations of the state of Kievan Rus and Kiev Christianity with their western branch in Byzantium continued through the 11th and 12th centuries. Kiev not only maintained trade contracts with Byzantium, but also dynastic marriages were concluded between the states. Not only the daughters of Yaroslav the Wise were married to Byzantine princes, but international marriages were also concluded in the 12th century. This is another argument that the true history of Christianity in Kievan Rus dates back to the mid-11th century, because from the mid-11th century, European Christian monarchs held it as an honor to marry daughters of Prince Yaroslav the Wise. This meant one very important thing. They no longer perceived Kievan Rus as being lands inhabited by some uncultured, uneducated, wild barbarian and pagan peoples. There were common European processes. In other words, every country fought for control over the church, as the existence of a church center within the territory of the state constituted a threat to other states in many ways. Among them, there were financial problems and spiritual control over the population of a certain country. When it all comes down to it, the fact that emperors and popes in Western Europe stood in opposition to one another was by no means by pure happenstance.
Тобто це ж не випадково. Була в Західній Європі, скажімо, боротьба між імператорами і папами.
Nevertheless, we shouldn't cherish illusions towards Byzantine emperors because they maintained strict control over the Constantinople Patriarch and the Eastern Christian Church. Of course, the emperors tried to control religious life in all countries that were converted to Christianity by Byzantine emissaries. But there were backward processes. Secular authorities of such Orthodox states as Kiev and Rus tried to control the election of church hierarchs and appointed their own people to these posts. This process was much easier in Orthodoxy than in Catholicism because the Catholic Church was and is indivisible. After all, the Orthodox Church was divided into autocephalos and local churches.
Зараз уже, більшість православних країн, вони мають свою автокефальну церкву. Тобто це процес закономірний і краще, скажімо так, піти на...
Nowadays, the majority of Orthodox countries have their own autocephalous churches. This is a natural process. It was better to agree to the alignment of interests than it was to succumb to processes that had already taken place in Western Europe when the majority of Christian countries became free from Rome.
Зрештою, як я вже казав, мали місце потім у Західній Європі. Тобто, коли там потім просто великий шмат християнського світу випав з-під влади Риму взагалі.
Nowadays, Albanian, Macedonian and even Canadian Orthodox churches have their autocephaly. But the Ukrainian church came up against obstacles to the establishment of an autocephalous church, and these problems began from the Lithuanian-Russian period. Learn more about this latest episode in the history of the ecclesiastical world in our next program. Recall that every phenomenon has its for and against, its pro and contra.